Hello and welcome to game 86 of the 15th TCEC Superfinal played between Leela Chess 0 and Stockfish. Now this was a very short game, a real gem in the Dutch Leningrad, where Leela got in a very beautiful queenside attack, as we'll immediately see. The game started with d4, f5 and now g3. Why is white playing g3 here when black plays f5, the Dutch? Well, I explained that in another video from the Premier Division of this same TCEC event, the game Ethereal and Leela, which was a Dutch stonewall. Check it out, there should be a link in the upper right. The game continued with knight f6, bishop g2, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, castles, c4, d6, knight c3, and in this position black has many options. I explained most of the plans for black and white in another video from the US Chess Championships played between Jeffrey Zhang and Nakamura. Hikaru managed to win there with on the black side of the Dutch in a very nice game. The game continued with knight c6, trying to get in e5, and here after d5, Naka went for knight a5, Stockfish went for knight e5 instead, and after knight takes and pawn takes, we get into this position where black, having a majority of pawns on the king side, will try to attack there with moves like e4, f4, and has ideas like h6, g5, and queen e8, queen h5, knight g4, and trying to get an attack on the king. In the meantime, white tries to play in the center and on the queen side and tries to advance these pawns and create a passed pawn there. Leela continued here with queen b3, putting pressure on the b7 pawn, and Stockfish replied with rook b8, not only to defend the b7 pawn but also get out of this dangerous diagonal here. Rook d1, and this is now a new move in the position. Both bishop e3 and c5 have been tried here before. Rook d1 is a new move, defending d5 and trying to get in c5. Bishop d7, and now a4. Leela would like to push this pawn up the board and open this rook. c5. Stockfish played this very good move, c5, trying to put a break on white's expansion on the queen side. And if this pawn would remain on c5, then Stockfish could get ideas like knight d8 and knight d6, where the knight would nicely block the d5 pawn and would also attack c4 and e4, so that knight would stand very well on the d6 square. But Leela didn't allow this pawn on c5 and he just took en passant. And here, taking with the bishop would be nice to counter white's bishop, but unfortunately this fails to rook takes queen, which is better for white. So instead of that, Stockfish had to take with the b pawn, which has the downside that it splits these pawns and makes them easier to attack. This rook now attacks the queen, so Leela played queen a3, and she's now threatening actually bishop take on c6 because of black's bishop being pinned to the queen. So queen c7, and now b4. Leela is trying to get in b5 and, having the 3-on-2 majority, create a passed pawn. And in this position, Stockfish now played a very nice move. He played e4. It's very hard to find a better move for black in this position. This blunts white's light squared bishop and in the same time opens up black's dark squared bishop. Very nice move. And now it's Leela's turn to find a beautiful move. It's actually a beautiful plan. If you could pick up this bishop from c1 and land it on a square, where would you like to place that bishop? Pause the video if you'd like to think about it. A very nice square for that bishop would be on c5, where it would attack in all directions, the pawn on a7, the rook, the pawn on e7, and it would be just a dream square for that bishop. But instead of going to e3 and from there to c5, Leela found an even better move. She would like to go to c5 when this pawn is not on e7, because then the bishop, as soon as it gets to c5, would attack a rook on f8. But not only that, without the pawn on e7, this bishop would threaten to get to d6 and fork those two heavy pieces. So instead of e3, Leela went for bishop f4 first, attacking the queen and this rook, and basically forcing e5. And only now, after e5 has been played and d6 has been weakened, only now she played bishop e3, heading to c5. And the threat of getting the bishop to d6 and winning down the rook on b8 is an immediate threat. So Stockfish had to play here bishop e6, and after bishop c5, rook d8 to not allow the bishop to get to d6. But here Leela now played b5, and now even the queen attacks the d6 square. And since now the rook on b8 is really in trouble, Stockfish had to move it to c8. But now came rook takes on d8, and Stockfish doesn't have a good way to recapture that rook. If he takes with the rook, then he sets himself up on this diagonal and could lose the exchange. Leela could play here a5 with the idea to get in b6. And if, let's say, Stockfish would play here bishop takes on c4, then after b6 he doesn't have good options here. If he takes this pawn, then bishop b6 and the rook on d8 will be lost. And if he doesn't take, let's say he plays queen e7, then pawn takes on a7, and this pawn is very dangerous, could become a queen very soon. And if instead of bishop takes on c4 he would take on b5, then after knight b5, attacking the queen and the pawn on a7, the pawn on a7 will fall anyway, and white would be better. So instead of that, instead of taking back with the rook, Leela took with the queen, allowing this bishop now to take on a7. At this point Leela is 2 pawns up, but after queen a5, bishop c5, Stockfish managed to take back the pawn on c4. The game continued with bishop b4, queen a7, and now b takes on c6, rook takes on c6, and Leela managed to create a passed pawn on a4, and she's trying to herd that in. She continued with rook d1, and now Stockfish played h5 to allow this king to hide on h7. e3, saving the pawn from e2, allowing this knight to maybe move. But this created the d3 weakness in White's camp, and Stockfish would like to land this bishop here. He would have a very active bishop on d3 defended by that pawn on e4. Unfortunately, this doesn't work for Stockfish because Leela could take on d3, and after pawn takes, Leela could take the rook on c6 and be better. So instead of bishop d3 after e3, Stockfish played king h7, and after h3 he moved the rook back to c8. Now bishop d3 would work, but Leela now played knight b5, attacking the queen on a7, and taking the knight with the bishop is not very useful for black, because after the queen exchange this pawn is just closer to becoming a queen, so it's not very helpful for Stockfish. And after knight b5 he instead played queen a6, but now Leela pinned the bishop on c4. Bishop d3 now wouldn't be that strong. Leela could just take the rook or play knight c7. After bishop d3, knight c7, queen b7, bishop d6, and this is not so great for black. So after rook c1, Stockfish preferred to play knight d5 here and attack this bishop on b4. If he could take the bishop, then after that he could maybe play bishop f8 to take control of this diagonal and then try to stop the pawn on a4 on the dark squares. But in this position now Leela played knight d6, attacking the rook on c8. But Stockfish didn't mind. He took on b4 and went for 2 pieces for the rook. And here after knight takes, he played knight d3, attacking this rook, rook c2, knight e1, rook c1, knight back to d3, and now rook c3. And here Stockfish eventually took the knight on c8. Leela now forces a queen exchange with queen a2, bishop takes, rook takes, bishop d5. Leela continued with rook d8, attacking the bishop, bishop c6, attacking the pawn, so a5. And here Stockfish played f4, and this is a blunder. Stockfish couldn't calculate Leela's threats, and he didn't see that he's lost here. Leela now played rook takes on d3, and after pawn takes, she took the bishop on c6. And even though they are in an opposite colored bishop endgame, Stockfish is lost here. At this point Stockfish realized he's in trouble, but it was already too late. If he plays here d2, then Leela has bishop a4 stopping the pawn, and then king f1, king e2 comes and picking up the pawn on d2. And this bishop on g7 can guard both d2 and a7, the queening square for the a pawn. He could only do that from e3, but e3 is not available for that bishop, so d2 is no good. After bishop takes on c6, Stockfish continued with bishop f8, and now g takes on f4, e takes on f4, e takes on f4, bishop c5, guarding a7 and putting pressure on f2. Leela here played king f1, king h6, f3. Leela is not afraid of this bishop coming to e3 and picking up f4, because quite simply that bishop doesn't have time to pick up the f4 pawn. He has to guard a7. And here Stockfish tried g5, trying desperately to get a pawn on f4, or if the pawn takes, the king, to guard the e3 square, so that this bishop then can defend the pawn from d2 and also keep an eye on a7. But unfortunately here for him, Leela just quite simply played f5, creating another passed pawn, and now she's threatening bishop e4 and picking up this pawn. So there's no bishop e3 here, because white has bishop e4, and after d2 and king e2, white wins in a similar fashion as in the game. So after f5, Stockfish immediately played d2, and now after king e2, he played king g7. And question for you guys, why can't Leela pick up the pawn on d2? If the king takes on d2, then Stockfish has bishop b4, check, and picking up the pawn on a5, and this is just a draw. So after king g7, Leela played bishop e4, and after king f6, she played now a6. And since now there's no fork anymore, this pawn is in trouble on d2, so Stockfish had to defend it with the bishop on e3. And this is of course making use of the fact that the king can't take on e3, because then this pawn promotes. But after the very simple bishop c2 taking away d1 from the pawn, this bishop is in trouble. He can't defend both d2 and a7. If he goes to bishop f4, let's say, then this pawn promotes. And if the bishop stays on this diagonal, then black loses the pawn on d2, and with two passed pawns on a6 and f5, white would be winning. So another beautiful game by Leela. She managed to create a passed pawn on the queen side and just create threats. And even though they ended up in an opposite colored bishop endgame, the a pawn made the difference and Leela managed to win. Thanks for watching, and check out some of the other videos. Bye bye.